Okay, so now I I start my presentation. Thank you. So, in my presentation, I aim to analyze how Carolingian dynasty utilized the musical aesthetics as a technology of power to stabilize the authority of the Holy Roman Empire. And this process, initiated through the political and administrative initiative of Pippin, and culminated in the creation of what we would today define as a brand. Okay. Um, um, this brand is something that assimilated Franco-Roman chant into the figure of Gregory the Great, which is what we know as Gregorian chant. We can identify three stratified levels of this process. The first level, eminently normative, defines the framework within which musical practice could be progressively standardized. It finds its most complete expression in Admonitio Generalis in 789. Here, the priority is creating the institutional conditions of uniformity. The goal is to correct and discipline ecclesiastic life, imposing conformity to the Roman model and establishing a principle of liturgical unity across the entire imperial space, which was very vast. Sorry. The second level concerns the mechanism of transmission and implementation. In this phase, the reform materialized through the mobility of cantors, chanting monks, and the circulation of liturgical books. The activity of monastic and episcopal scriptoria. Musical knowledge is transferred from Rome to Frankish territories and progressively internalized. The adoption of the Roman repertoire is not passive because it involves processes of adaptation, negotiation, and progressive performative stabilization. And it is during this phase that the idea of a unified chant consolidates, even before definitive notation of fixation. And the third level involves the symbolic and retrospective construction of the repertoire's authority. Here, the figure of Gregory the Great, Gregorius Magnus, intervenes. His image is transformed into founding principle of Western liturgical chant. Through the development of the iconographic models of Gregorius Scriba and Gregorius Dictans, in which the dove or the Holy Spirit guarantees the divine inspiration of the text, a true operation of a posteriori legitimation is produced. Furthermore, in this it's connected with the Christian philosophy, resolving a hard problem, the problem of music raised by Boethius. The repertoire is no longer perceived as a result of Carolingian reform, but as an original and authoritative tradition attributed to an apostolic source and directly assisted by the Holy Spirit. Okay, this is the historical context. The formation of the Holy Roman Empire constitutes the historical framework for the definition and diffusion of the so-called Gregorian chant. After the dissolution of the Western Roman Empire, early medieval Europe was characterized by strong political and liturgical fragmentation. Alongside the Roman Rite, numerous local traditions coexisted, including, for example, Gallican Rite, Mozarabic, Beneventan rites, and so on. The Carolingian dynasty understood the strategic value of liturgy as a tool for cultural and political cohesion. The alliance between the Franks and the Pope was consolidated under Pippin the Short, reached its peak with Charlemagne. his son, who pursued a vast project of religious unification. His imperial coronation by Pope Leo III on Christmas night in the year 800 symbolically sanctioned the restoration of a Western Christian rite based on the integration of political and ecclesiastic power. However, even in the preceding years, Charlemagne had promoted intense reform aimed at unifying liturgical practice. And in this context, the Admonitio Generalis that you can see here in the slide assumes particular importance. It was a capitulary promulgated by Charlemagne on March 23 in 789, and in its 83 articles, it defined the program of Christianization promoted by the Carolingian ruler. This document established norm for clergy education, the correction of liturgical and biblical books, and the founding of schools. But above all, it promoted the uniform adoption of the Roman liturgy. Okay, so here you can see a text from Libri Carolini, because we can see that the diffusion of Gregorian chant was made possible by the network of monastic scriptoria, as we said, although pneumatic notation only appears steadily in 9th century. But the Carolingian project favored the transformation of a predominantly oral practice into a codified tradition. In this testimony that you can see in the slide from Libri Carolini in late 8th century, we read Charlemagne's official position regarding the reform of the rite, with particular attention to liturgical chant. You can read, for example, ut non esset disparo ordo. This is a very important word, ordo psallendi, which means so that those who share the same faith would not practice a different form of chant. Sorry. This is an extraordinary formulation because it establishes a direct equivalence between unity and belief and the unity of sound in this case. And the chant is conceived as a single venerable tradition, veneranda tradizione, not as a plurality of local practice. This is another extract from the epistle of Archbishop Leidrardo of Lyon, who sends a report to Charlemagne stating that he has reformed the liturgical chant according to the imperial will. Even here we can read the term ordo, which is fundamental. Chant is conceived as an ordered system rather than a collection of a melody. Even here we can read ordo psallenti and so on. Secondum ritum sacri palazzi. The reference to the imperial palace is extremely significant. Liturgical authority is now centralized around Carolingian court. And this passage revealed the institutional infrastructure behind the reform, because we can read Nam habeo scholas cantorum, esquibus plerique sunt eruditi, ut alios etiam erudire possint. So the goal is not simply performance, but the creation of a self-propagation system of transmission. The unification project consolidated further under Charlemagne thanks to Alcuin of York and the court intellectuals. Their missions of correctio aimed to eradicate the corruption of local rites, to restore presumed original purity. And this reflects Alcuin's epistemic stance. Uniformity of text and rite is necessary condition for the ontological cohesion of the empire. Transform Gallican diversity into a single Roman truth. the diffusion of the repertoire was entrusted to the monk of the Schola Cantorum, agents that we might even describe as human hard disks, due to their mnemonic capacity for approximately 3,000 chants. They were not just music teachers, but vectors of standardized knowledge system that installed emotional synchrony across fragmented territories. In this testimony, we can read that Paul I sent the monk Simeon to the friends, specifically in order to instruct the monks in the correct, even here is said, psalmodi modulatio. That is the regulated and proper execution of liturgical chant. This detail highlights how the transmission of chant was not left to informal practice, but was instead organized as a controlled process of instruction, entrusted to qualified specialists of the Roman Schola Cantorum. So, another fundamental aspect of the Carolingian reform finds in theoretical foundation in the rediscovery of Boethius, and in particular in the hierarchy established in his De Institutione Musica by Boethius, where Boethius distinguishes three forms of music: musica mondana, musica umana, and musica instrumentalis. Musica mundana is the harmony of the cosmos, governing the proportions of the universe, the movement of the stars, and the balance of creation itself. Musica umana is an internal harmony, bringing together soul and body. And the third is musica instrumentalis, which is the audible music produced by voices and musical instruments. Within this hierarchy, as you can see, musica instrumentalis occupies the lowest ontological level because it belongs to the realm of sensory perception. Sound is so ephemeral, corporeal, and potentially deceptive. And this creates a significant theoretical tension for Christian liturgical chant, which necessarily exists, of course, as an audible performance. The problem had already emerged in patristic throughout, for example, in St. Augustine, who repeatedly expressed concern that the faithful may become attached to the sensual beauty of music rather than the sacred truth conveyed by the text. And the danger for St. Augustine was that sound could seduce the senses instead of elevating the intellect toward the divine contemplation. So it is precisely here that the Carolingian construction of Gregorian chant becomes philosophically significant. Carolingian iconography presents Gregory the Great not as a composer in the modern sense, but as a divinely inspired mediator. In the models of the Gregorius Scriba and Gregorius Dictans, as we are going to see, the dove, which is the Holy Spirit, guarantees the chant does not originate from human invention, but from a divine revelation itself. So let's look at visual rendering of the Auctoritas through iconographic evolution. The iconography of Gregory the Great evolved alongside the development of his authority, gradually establishing a specific and recognizable symbolic identity. Although relatively scarce, the iconographic evidence predating the Carolingian Renaissance, as you can see here in the slide, already reveals the emergence of a stable visual type intended to emphasize Gregory's doctrinal authority with his role as a master of the Western Church, rather than any explicit association with music. In the earliest representation, he appears barehead, frequently alongside the other Latin Church fathers, holding a book or a scroll as the primary attribute of his theological and pastoral authority. This is a significant example, and this is the so-called Boethius diptych, which is dated between the 7th and 8th century and preserved in Museo Diocesano di Brescia. Here, Gregory is represented as youthful, wearing the pallium and holding a book in his left hand, while facing the viewer in a gesture of blessing alongside San Jerome and St. Augustine. This image reflected the broader historical context of late antiquity and early Middle Ages. The decline of Western Roman Empire, the consolidation of ecclesiastic institution, and the increasing centrality of the papacy within Latin Christianity. In this context, the book became the visual marker. We are no dove, as we can see later. This is the marker of Gregory's authority within the formation of medieval religious culture. During the Carolingian Renaissance, Gregory's iconography underwent a decisive shift. 9th and 10th century manuscripts and ivories depict the Pope writing under the direct inspiration of the Holy Spirit. This posture, with the head inclined toward the dove, introduced a vital theological dimension. The repertoire's Auctoritas derives not from a human author, but from God, but from a divine revelation. A prime example is this that you can see here in the slide, which is a 10th century ivory plaque, which is in Constantin Historicus Museum and attributed to the so-called Master of the Gregory tablet, and it depicts Gregory enthroned while the dove dictates the text. Crucially, the lower register shows 3 monastic scribes copying the dictation, visualizing the Carolingian culture program. Divine knowledge is codified and disseminated through imperial scriptoria to enforce liturgical uniformity. And in this model of Gregorius Scriba, the act of writing serves as a metatextual function, legitimizing the Roman tradition and the antiphonarium, which Gregorius is writing, as sacred and immutable. This transformation effectively resolves the Boethian tension regarding the tripartition of music. By presenting the chant as divinely inspired, the Carolingians aligned it more with musica mundana, elevating it above the fallible realm of musica instrumentalis. A further stage in the evolution of Gregorian iconography can be observed in the miniature of the so-called Registrum Gregori, produced around 983, and now preserved in Stadtbibliothek Trier, attributed to the master of the Registrum Gregori. The work belongs to a luxury manuscript, probably intended for an episcopal or imperial environment, where artistic refinement contributed directly to the construction of these auctoritas. The miniature depicts Gregory with a solemn architectural setting suggestive of both ecclesiastical and imperial power. Once again, we have the dove for the Holy Spirit, and it signified the transcendent origin of knowledge, removing liturgical chant from the sphere of contingency and grounding it instead in a divine and immutable source. Stylistically, we can see that the image represents one of the highest achievements of Ottonian manuscript illumination. Okay, so the time is running fast. Here we have the Acter antiphonary, preserved at the Abbey of St. Gall, which is very important, and provides one of the clearest testimonies to the association between Gregory the Great and the liturgical chant. In the opening miniature, the Pope is shown seated and inspired by the dove while holding the antiphonary, whereas the scribe actor appears within the dedicatory scene, emphasizing the central role of monastery in the preservation and transmission of these repertoires. Produced in one of the principal European centers for the development of Gregorian chant, which is St. Gall. The codex is of exceptional liturgical and codicological importance. Text and pneumatic notation coexist organically. The miniature consequently acquires a deeply metatextual function. The iconography, therefore, emphasizes the mediated nature of transition and the dynamic relationship between orality and writing. So, to conclude, this analysis aim to demonstrate that the iconography of Gregory the Great was far more than a simple hagiographic portrait, because it serves as a philosophical manifesto of the Carolingian Renaissance. We can summarize the efficacy of this operation through these key points. The transformation of Auctoritas, as we have seen, iconography acted as a powerful device for legitimation by shifting the focus from the figure of the scriba to that of the dictans, which is the inspired mediator. The Carolingians so executed a brilliant retrospective branding strategy. So Franco-Roman chant was no longer perceived as the result of mere administrative reform, but as a unified product guaranteed by a celestial auctoritas, making it essentially indisputable. Then we have the second point, resolving the gnoseological dilemma. The image of the dove responds to the urgent epistemological questions of the time, sparked by the rediscovery of Boethian thought. In a system that mistrusted the fallibility of the sense and perception, physical perception, divine inspiration guarantees that musica instrumentalis, or at least this kind of music of audible chant, is not the fragile human invention. Instead, it becomes a faithful echo of musica mondana, the perfect harmony of the cosmos. And the third point is from reform to ontological truth, because finally, the birth of pneumatic notation addresses the need of graphically fix this, we could say divine breath, because pneuma comes from the word pneuma in Greek, which means breath. And preserving it from the corruption of time. Through the symbolic elements like the iconographic curtain, which marks the epistemic boundary between revelation and sign, the Carolingian dynasty defined an intellectual border of West. And ultimately, Gregorian iconography was the decisive tool used to transform political necessity for uniformity into this ontological truth. And it is in this sacred space between the ear of the pontiff and the beak of the dove that the intellectual and liturgical identity of the Middle Ages was forged, establishing chant as the sonic infrastructure of what we today would say a unified empire. Here are some references and some sources that you can see also online. And I thank you everybody for your attention.